can take just a minute before my time actually starts to say, excuse me, to May, the Gibran Center, and the University of Maryland, two things. Alf shukr wa shukr and mashallah. This has been a wonderful, wonderful event. This quite impressive. I'm going to move that if I may.
Great, absolutely.
I'm sure that very few in this audience are unaware of either the size or importance of Mikhail Naimy's body of work. We've been hearing about him all day. The sheer volume of Naimy's writing is impressive by any standard. The published edition of his collected works runs to 9 volumes and well over 6,000 pages. The temporal span of Naimy's literary life is likewise extraordinary. He published his first work in 1913 and his last one in 1977. He lived to be 99 or 98, a few days short of 99. Equally striking is the diversity in Naimy's oeuvre. His published works include, and I have to look here because I'll leave something out, literary criticism, poetry, essays, theological exegesis, aphorisms, biography, autobiography, short stories, novels, plays, and more. It is an amazing body of work. And all of this, of course, is to say nothing of the quality of Naimy's writing, which is widely recognized by Arab readers, certainly, in particular the Lebanese, who love him dearly. One of the elements that I think unites this vast body of work is its didacticism. Naimy's writing displays a nearly ceaseless effort to instruct its readers, and it is that element that I have focused on in my paper. The paper that I submitted is quite long, so today I'm just going to try and spotlight a couple of what I hope are the more interesting points. It was, of course, Naimy's didacticism in the field of literature that had the greatest impact on the landscape of Arab thought in the 20th century. His early articles of literary criticism and theory shaped much of the attack on neoclassical Arabic literature and helped shift sensibilities toward new poetic forms and content, modeled primarily on Western Romanticism. All of this, however, and many of you know this, has been thoroughly researched and quite well documented, which is why I've turned my attention to another aspect of Naimy's writing, namely the literary didacticism in his novels. By didacticism, I am here referring to the conscious effort of writers to instruct their readers, to share with them knowledge or guidance. The significance of this teaching, of course, can range from the mundane to the sublime, and it can be delivered via both fiction and nonfiction. But in this talk, what I'm interested in is fiction, literary didacticism. For a great part of man's history, didacticism in prose, poetry, and drama was common. The Greeks, as we know, regarded the teaching of morals to be one of the primary aims of creative writing. And of course, pre-modern Arabic literature boasts a robust tradition of didacticism. Hekmah, or wisdom or knowledge, was one of the recognized generic aims of poetry, in fact. And prose edeb writing, that is prose writing in classical medieval time, is likewise replete with works of instruction and advice. Turning to the modern West, morality tales and what were often called improving stories, I always like that term, were being written and consumed well into the 19th century without too much concern that the demands of instructing readers may be in some tension with the literary quality of a particular piece of fiction. Well, this tension was shattered in the West, particularly when Edgar Allan Poe famously attacked what he called the didactic heresy. Since that time, which was in the middle of the 19th century, to call a literary work didactic has been to castigate it as unfashionable, naive, unworthy of a serious reader's attention. Didacticism suggests an unrefined work that preaches its lessons so obviously that it undermines its own literary qualities. The philosopher Charles Repp, however, has argued that didacticism in and of itself is not an unworthy aim of literature. The fault, he thinks, rather lies in the way in which an author presents his or her instruction. quoting rep, "What makes overt instruction in literature objectionable is that it provides evidence of certain epistemic vices, such as intellectual arrogance, dogmatism, and prejudice, which undercut the author's credibility and thereby compromise the work's value as a source of instruction. It is thus because instruction is an important literary value that overt instruction is sometimes a fault in literature." End quote. What I will try to summarize for you here today is my exploration of didacticism in 4 of Naimy's long works of fiction: Liqa, Mudhakarat al-Arqash, the Book of Mirdad, which was written in English, hence the English title, and El-Yom al-Akhir. I will try to show how Naimy used various narrative and generic strategies to blunt the criticism that can be leveled against any sort of literary didacticism. To begin, Naimy's message in all 4 of these novels is essentially the same. After being introduced to theosophy while a student at Professor DeYoung's University of Washington, Naimy began to read widely in religious and spiritual writings of all kinds. The set of beliefs he developed and that are expressed in the 4 novels under consideration here can be summarized as follows. Naimy sees life as a school or a laboratory in which man is given the opportunity to learn about his soul and his place in the cosmos. Now, if life is a school, its curriculum is enormous and therefore requires more than a single lifetime to complete. From this notion, then, it follows that it is necessary to repeat lives, or in other words, reincarnation is necessary. These repeated opportunities for learning only make sense, of course, if there is a subject that can be mastered. And that subject is no less than the cosmic order, what Naimy refers to throughout his writings as an-nidham. In keeping with Eastern and theosophical tenets, reincarnation implies a system of justice or karmic balance. Man's aim in life, then, is to understand his own soul and its place in the universal order. In order to do that, he must work to overcome his fallible senses, his desires, and all the other earthly traps that snare the lower parts of his soul here on earth. He must seek to overcome these impediments so that he may eventually gain complete knowledge, reunite with the One, end the cycle of reincarnation, and indeed become a god himself. In all 4 of our novels, Naimy's characters lay out and expand upon all of these concepts. And it is these explications of a sort of theosophical thought that make Naimy's novels so overridingly didactic. Now, my paper is full of all sorts of examples from the novels, but given the time constraints, I will not go through all of those. You'll just have to take my word for it. And since you don't know me at all, I'm surprised that you would do so, but that's okay. I've known to pay my debts and that sort of thing. As noted, the primary danger with literary didacticism lies in offending, or frankly boring, one's reader by preaching to them rather than telling them a good story. How then does Naimy work to overcome this hurdle? Part of the answer lies in his choices about 2 things: narrative authority and genre. One of the ways in which Naimy seeks to establish authority within the fictional world he creates is through what might be thought of as found texts. In, for instance, Mudhakarat al-Arqash, the book opens with the narrator of the story discovering this character al-Arqash's diary, hence a found text, and that diary then forms the bulk of the novel. Similarly, the narrator in the Book of Mirdad is given a found text, a scripture, when he climbs a mountain, as we'll talk about in a moment. As an aside, I might mention, too, with regard to the Book of Kahlil, which has been talked about quite a bit and just was, this notion of using a found text as a literary device had its probably earliest appearance in master literature, I would think, in the Book of Kahlil, because it is based supposedly on a manuscript found in the Khedive Library in Cairo. So this was not a new device. Naimy uses the found texts in Mudhakarat al-Arkash and the Book of Mirdad as venues for his didactic message. Importantly, the found texts Naimy chooses are ones that do not forbid didacticism, but in fact embrace it. That is, one is not at all surprised to read expressions of an author's thoughts or spiritual beliefs in a diary. That's where you would expect to see such things. Likewise, a scripture is probably the quintessential didactic text. Indeed, the diary and scripture in these two novels give Naimy the latitude to incorporate frequent, lengthy philosophical passages that one might have difficulty justifying in the usual narrative structure of a novel. After all, a hero that spends most of his time in soliloquies or expounding philosophies to other characters would strike most readers as a bit excessive. By using this found text device, Naimy is able to step back. It adds a layer between himself, I think, as author and his reader. Psychologically, I think this both helps distance Naimy from the views expressed and adds an aura of authority to them. Now, this is not to suggest that Naimy wished to keep the spiritual ideas expressed in these novels at arm's length. On the contrary, he clearly believed in these notions firmly. But by not stating them directly himself, I think he is able to blunt the criticisms noted earlier of authorial intellectual arrogance, dogmatism, and prejudice. If Naimy's use of found text is one strategy to avoid the pitfalls of didacticism, I think his deft use of the genre of the fantastic is an even more effective one. I would argue that all four of the novels that I've looked at originate within what the structuralist critic Tsvetan Todorov defines as the genre of the fantastic. As I expect many of you may know, this genre of the fantastic describes a literary world similar to ours, into which intrudes an inexplicable event, character, or a fact that seemingly defies the laws of normality. This results in a hesitation, and it's this hesitation that defines the fantastic genre. Both the hero of the story and the reader being most important, must decide if the odd events that were just introduced can be rationally explained, in which case this fantastic genre is resolved into a secondary genre, often referred to as the uncanny, that is, an unusual story. If events cannot be rationally accounted for, if they contravene natural laws, readers will interpret the text as falling in the genre of the marvelous, and that's where we find things like fairy tales and that sort of thing. It is this fantastic hesitation and its necessary resolution into one of these two other categories that I think Naimy uses to militate against the pitfalls of the didactic. In Liqa, Leonardo, a young violinist, bewitches a girl, Baha, with his playing, sending her into a comatose state, as we heard earlier, and that's indeed where she stays throughout the novel. This event echoes a similar local legend told in the story involving a long-ago shepherd and a maiden, thus hinting at Leonardo, the violin player's reincarnation. Baha's swoon when he plays presents the fantastic moment of hesitation. The reader must ask, is this a rational or a supernatural event? Naimy prolongs this hesitation almost throughout the entire story, thus keeping his reader on the hook. It is only at the tale's very end that a decision on the reader's part is compelled. Baha's sudden recovery and then the immediate death of Leonardo and Baha in one another's arms force a decision. Is this uncanny or marvelous? Here, I think Naimy hopes his reader will favor an uncanny interpretation over a marvelous one, thus leaving open the possibility of the truth of reincarnation that is really the core of the story's message. If the tension of the fantastic helps sustain interest in Liqa, as we just saw, it is the diary in Mudhakarat al-Arkash that carries the narrative and the novel's didactic message. Mudhakarat al-Arkash presents a story that is odd, but only uncanny. In it, a taciturn loner named al-Arkash is haunted by his bride's horrific murder on their wedding night, a murder for which we eventually learn al-Arkash himself is guilty. As readers, we follow this fascinating murder mystery, and like all good murder mysteries, understand that its questions will be resolved in worldly terms. Its resolution may prove unexpected, but at most only uncanny. This isn't going to turn into a fairy tale. The story itself, then, is firmly rooted in natural reality. Yet the ideas Naimy expresses through Al-Arkash's diary are anything but natural for most readers. Reincarnation, karmic justice, the cosmic order, these are not ideas most readers will relegate to the ordinary. For many readers, these ideas will seem marvelous in the sense that they're inexplicable by natural laws and rational arguments with which they are familiar. And yet, this is exactly the sort of argumentation Naimy presents in Al-Arkash's diary. Here then, Naimy has cleverly hooked his reader with a murder mystery whose uncanny events provide a bedrock of believability. The reader is thus carried along through the story, while I think being slyly encouraged to also locate Al-Arkash's worldviews in the uncanny, that is the possible, rather than the marvelous. That is to admit that, well, maybe these are rational. Where Liqa and Mudhakarat al-Arkash tell ultimately uncanny stories full of what might seem as rather marvelous spiritual notions, the Book of Mirdad presents a somewhat different didactic strategy. Here, a narrator hears the legend of an abbot magically robbed of his speech and imprisoned 150 years ago in a monastery on a local mountaintop. The narrator determines to climb the mountain to test the truth of this legend. The climb is harrowing and involves several fantastic encounters. At the end of the climb, the narrator meets the legendary abbot who, now able to speak, tells him that the legend he had heard was essentially accurate. At this point, the reader stands at Todorov's fantastic moment of hesitation. He or she is unsure whether the events related thus far are uncanny but explicable, or supernatural and therefore marvelous. I think most readers will follow the lead of the narrator of the story and interpret the events that have unfolded as uncanny but not marvelous. That is, the narrator could have climbed the mountain. He could have encountered the strange figures he claims to have met along the way, and he could have met a monk at the mountain's top. At the same time, the power to strike someone dumb and a monk's living for more than 150 years certainly verge at least on the marvelous. And here the reader teeters, leaning toward the uncanny and what Todorov in his theories calls the fantastic uncanny subgenre. But in any case, it's not clear at this point, is this going to be a marvelous tale, a fairy story? It is at this point then that an entirely ordinary event occurs. The monk gives the Book of Mirdad to the narrator. If the reader has so far been drawn toward the uncanny rather than the marvelous, he or she is firmly pushed in that direction by the Book of Mirdad itself, which records virtually no supernatural events. Indeed, the spiritual truths that Mirdad reveals may be startling to readers. They may be otherworldly, but they are no more supernatural than religious discussions of, say, salvation, heaven, hell, etc. What Naimy has done then is create expectations of the uncanny in readers and then treat them to a new scripture full of marvelous notions, but not of marvels. I would argue that the last of the four novels explored here, El Yom Al-Akhir, shows the full maturity of Naimy's use of the fantastic genre and also his wedding of storytelling with didacticism. The novel begins at precisely the fantastic border between the uncanny and the marvelous and invites the reader to join the hero of the story, Musa al-Askari, in hesitating over how to understand an eerie midnight voice that comes into his room and tells him, "Arise and bid farewell to your final day." Musa is a man of supreme rationality. In fact, he's a professor of philosophy who must hesitate before this extraordinary event. Can he explain it, in which case it will resolve into the uncanny, or must he accept it as supernatural and thus marvelous? And of course, the reader faces exactly the same question. Naimy maintains his hesitation throughout the novel, never allowing his narrative to settle comfortably in the marvelous genre. Indeed, at every point where the reader is tempted to see events as marvelous, Naimy provides explanations that redefine them as simply uncanny, simply unusual. For instance, the eerie voice which repeatedly returns and engages Musa al-Askari throughout the book is revealed halfway through the novel to have actually been a real person. Or again, Musa has a son who suddenly recovers from muteness and paralysis, which seems miraculous, but it's rationalized away by a description from his doctor. And even the frankly marvelous parts of the story that are extant are attenuated by being told through dreams. Once again, then, Naimy keeps his reader within the generic realm of the surprising but true, which I think is the ideal place for him to foreground spiritual teachings that may seem outlandish to some readers, but which generically cannot be dismissed as simply parts of marvelous fairy tales. So to wrap things up, if literary didacticism had acquired such a bad reputation by the time Naimy wrote these novels, one might wonder why he turned to it to express his message. He had previously written various nonfiction pieces to convey exactly the same ideas. So why did he feel the need to do so in fiction? I think part of the answer lies in the fact that didactic literature, even if spurned by critics, was still current when Naimy was writing. In particular, theosophic and spiritualist ideas were alive in society. Gibran, for instance, records talking about them with Naimy and others. Likewise, these kind of ideas, these theosophical and spiritualist ideas, were also being expressed in the quote-unquote high literature of the time. If you think of people like Yeats and Pound and Eliot, all of whom, by the way, were almost exact contemporaries of Naimy, except he outlived them all, but all born around the same time, you can see the importance of occult influences in their work, too. I think equally important may have been popular fiction. In his autobiography, interestingly, Naimy records reading the spiritualist novel Ziska in 1918, written by the wildly popular but now completely forgotten Marie Corelli. Naimy's remarks after reading the novel were, quote, "He was unable to escape from thinking about the unseen power which was steering my life. The book had awakened all of my mystical inclinations," mystical here being a translation of Sophia. Such a novel probably also suggested to Naimy ways in which he too might convey his spiritual ideas through fiction. I have my own opinions about about each of these novels, and would be happy to share them with you in the Q&A. In general, however, I think one must appreciate the success of Naimy's didactic literature. The Book of Mirdad, while not a publishing phenomenon on par with The Prophet, gained an early following and has been translated many, many times into many languages and even adapted as a stage play. While literary critics might ignore the book, many leaders of the spiritualist community regard it as a masterpiece. And the Book of Mirdad remains in print in a number of languages. The broad appeal of the other three novels considered here has been less, in part due to their being published in Arabic rather than English, I think, and also due to their appearing in the post-World War II Arab world. By then, Naimy's spiritualist ideas were so at odds with the standards, the prevailing literary standards of commitment, el-iltizam, that in Selma Jayusi's words, I think she sums it up well, he seemed like a strange voice coming from another world. But rather than despair about that, I'll just end by saying that for me, what this suggests is not that he was a strange voice coming from another world, but that I think his spiritual, his novels, including the spiritual didacticism, should probably better be understood not so much as just reshaping Arab thought, wherever our title is, but I think world thought, because these novels, particularly the Book of Mirdad, like the Book of Kahlil and a few of the other works we've talked about, really drew these writers into the world literary community at a time when people really weren't thinking of world literature in the way they do today. So I think that alone is a very important event. Thank you very much for your attention.